Greetings. Welcome to the Brain Gauge channel. I'm Mark Tomerdal, and I'm going to talk a little bit about connectivity, the connectivity score on the Brain Gauge metric. And it shows up on your bar chart right here. And TOJ is pointed at because it requires TOJ to be collected. It's a computed score, and it's computed between a thing called TOJ, or temporal ordered judgment, and temporal ordered judgment carrier. And I'm going to get to the details of that in a minute. So this is basically, it's used mostly by researchers, and a few clinicians are using it, but and have success with it. But let's take a look. And as I mentioned, here's results from a Brain Gauge app. And on here, you see TOJ and TOJ carrier. And, the TOJ score, normal values are 15 to 30 milliseconds. But what we do is we look at the difference between these two scores. It's actually a little more complicated than that, but basically we're using these scores to compute a connectivity score. And let's see why that makes sense. So let's go to the concept of illusory stimuli first. And illusions are really, really interesting. And you've probably seen a lot of them your whole life. People have flashed them in front of you and showed you things. But like over here, you say how many triangles are drawn, and the answer is none, because basically, your brain is connecting the dots. It's that simple. You draw something, and the brain will fill in the gaps. And over here, we have what we call a context-dependent illusion. And these orange circles look like they're different sizes. Mainly because this orange circle is viewed in the context of these smaller circles, and this orange circle is viewed in the context of these larger ones. So that makes this one look smaller and this one look larger. So there's different things you can do to condition the brain to feel things differently. And that's just what we did with this particular connectivity score. I'm going to show you a little bit to show you why it is a connectivity score. Well, temporal ordered judgment, again, we've talked about that and other things, what it is. But the baseline test is where you give a tap and then another tap, and then just say, okay, which one came first? Now, most people, they can usually feel this around, 25, 30 milliseconds with no problem. So the tracking typically looks like this, where it starts out with these 2 points 150 milliseconds apart. That's what this tracking means. And as it tracks down, it gets harder and harder, just like an eye chart. Starts out easy, 150 milliseconds, really easy to tell the difference. Unless you're talking to somebody with schizophrenia, they have real trouble with that. But 150 milliseconds all the way down to about 30 milliseconds, in this case, 29.9. And now, how are we going to change that? Well, the illusory condition gives a very, very weak sinusoidal stimulus, very weak at the same time. And now we give this beep, beep, right on top, these little 2 taps right on top of that illusory condition. And basically what happens, so let's just focus on this side here. So remember, over here, we came down to 30 milliseconds. Over here, we've got 30 milliseconds for the healthy controls. And then when we add that illusory confound, this value goes way up. And so what we're looking at is this difference here, and we do make a connectivity score out of that. But let's look at some other conditions or some other situations. One is with autism, where TOJ is worse to start with, but TOJc doesn't get any higher, or the confound doesn't make them any worse. Kids with concussion. These were student athletes. They basically, TOJ about the same or a little higher, but then the connectivity score is going to be pretty bad for these guys because that confound doesn't make them worse. Over here, focal dystonia. Focal dystonia is also like musician. This is basically musician's cramp, or writer's cramp. It's a dystonia where basically you're somebody who plays the violin 8 hours a day, and they get really severe problems with their hands because they use these 2 fingers that are that are vibrating together all day long, all the time. Well, let's look what happened here. Over here, you got a little bit of, TOJ was normal, but you get a little bit of this vibration, a little bit of this conditioning stimuli, and both of them go up. Okay, so we're saying, well, basically that's because this is an illusion. It makes the two fingers feel like they're the same. All right, so you're vibrating those adjacent cortical columns, and if they're coordinated and vibrating the same, then this first tap is actually activating both cortical ensembles. Both cortical ensembles that are side by side are getting activated at the same time. And that's why it makes it so hard to feel that condition. If you disrupt the connectivity in the brain, you disrupt those side by side actions, then you have a little disruption here, and basically you don't get any impact of the confound. But look over here, where these people have spent 8 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours a day playing musical string instruments, and not everybody has focal dystonia, but these people did. And when this was applied, this got much, much worse. So it's really kind of interesting. So you can actually see two different extremes here. So let's look a little bit more, because you're saying, yeah, we don't believe you. So let's look a little bit more. What we're doing is we're vibrating these two fingers and delivering stimuli. And in this case, we're actually recording from the place in the brain where digit 2 nerves project to. So you basically, what goes on is you've got nerves in your fingers, they project to your brain, and the ones in digit 2 project right here, and that's right beside the ones in digit 3. Here's digit 2, there's digit 3. So what happens when we just give a tap? So this tap is just like the tap that we give for TOJ's task. We give a tap at digit 2, and look, you get all this activity that's going on in the brain. But what happens over here at digit 3? There's no tap, and there's a little bit of activity. There's always going to be crosstalk. There's always a little bit of crosstalk, because a simple tap activates a large region of cortex. Now, what happens if we give just a little? And this is a cartoon. It's not to scale. This was actually a very, very small sinusoid. It's really not activating it, not generating much activity here. Not generating activity here, but both digits are getting a little activity. Now, when we give a tap here, we get more activation here, but now we're getting a lot of activation in digit 3. So there's still a little bit more activity in digit 2 than digit 3 representations, but you'll notice that it's going to make it much harder to tell the difference in terms of which one came first. You're having that crosstalk is making it hard. So if you disrupt that and disrupt that connection, then you won't get this crosstalk. So then the question is, what disrupts that crosstalk? Well, we'll talk about, there's a lot of different things that can. One's anatomical, one's physiological, and then combinations of the two. But let's look at some examples, or at least one example. What's the example of negative impact on connectivity? And this has got to do with interareal connections. Okay, so the brain is highly interconnected. That's really where all the power is, and that's where all the cool things are going on. And let's just say, we have area 3B and 1. That's where most mechanoreceptive input goes to. That's where you're getting a lot of vibration input. And then there's area 3A. Area 3 is right next door, and it gets a lot of the pain input. And when you get a lot of pain activating, if you have somebody who has chronic pain, this area is active quite a bit. And that area will suppress this area 3B. And it'll disrupt the connectivity in area 3B as well. This kind of suppression will make things much, much more difficult. And if you want to look at, what does it really look like? Here's area 3A, here's area 3B. Area 3C is something that we call the part of area 3A that actually promotes pain. And here's an area that suppresses pain. Just think that these areas are always fighting with each other. and they're trying to dominate for that perception to be felt. If you have a painful stimulus, it gets felt. But if you have chronic pain and it's active, it's going to be suppressing activity in this area. So what would be the prediction for synchronization metric with a pain condition? Well, let's take a look. Here, this is neurophysiological recording from one area, and this is in 3B1, and this through 38 degrees is normal, okay? And so you see activity here, and then that's during the stimulus, post-stimulus. So, you know, a little bit of chatter when the stimulus is turned off. What I want you to look at is, this is the first set of trials. Then you have another set of trials when it's hot, another set of trials after it's hot. So what we did was we vibrated the stimulus on the skin, heated that stimulus up so that it was noxious, and then turn the temperature back down. And let's just, without going through all this, look how organized. And I just tell you, when you see this very tight, this particular radial chart, that means it's very tight and it fits that sinusoid. So the sinusoid has been that was delivered, been converted to 360 degrees, and you see how well these spikes fit into that sinusoid. So they're synchronized. There's synchronized activity. Now, when you have heat, look at what it does. All of a sudden, that pain is making this unsynchronized activity. And then even after the heat is turned off, the pain's residual. And, you know, it's still, that the effect of that disruption is still there. So that kind of predicts that what's going to happen is, you know, you're going to disrupt connectivity with a painful stimulus or with a painful condition. So let's look at influence of pain on a synchronization metric. And these are chronic headache patients, and they were not having headache while they tested. So remember here, this is amplitude discrimination. I'm sorry, this is temporal order judgment. And this is about, you know, 25 milliseconds for the controls. And then that went up to about 80 milliseconds with the confound. So with that TOJ carrier stimulus, it got much, much worse. So TOJ, 25-ish milliseconds. TOJc, you know, goes up to well over 80. So that really shows that the controls really showed a big difference. Now, what do we have with the migraine or the headache patients who have chronic pain conditions? Well, their TOJ is higher, but the conditioning, that carrier, does not have any impact on them. So kind of to summarize is that the disruptions in connectivity basically cause, you know, the connectivity score to go down, cause the difference that is or the illusion to go away. So basically we see this in a lot of different conditions. You see disruptions in connectivity with pain, concussion, autism, and that'll be the subject of an autism talk in the science section later. Focal dystonia, I mentioned that. And TMS, experimental TMS. Well, what we did with that is we actually had people do the temporal order judgment test and the TOJc test. They did this test. And so with and without the illusion. And with the illusion, you know, the illusion had the same effect that you see in the controls. But then what we did is we actually put a negative pulse, turned activity off in somatosensory cortex, the part of cortex that handles mechanical inputs. Well, as I mentioned, TOJc, or the TOJ with the illusion, is typically much, much worse. But when we turn that on, when we turn the stimulus on, the transcranial magnetic stimulus that was designed to turn off that part of the brain, TOJ actually, that illusion disappeared, and the TOJ score actually got better. It disrupted the illusion. So we have a lot of different pieces of evidence that, you know, are prediction about what it's doing actually works. It's not used that often just because people want a shorter test battery. Anyway, that's pretty much it for the day for my talk. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out, and I'll be happy to answer more. Have a good day.